Run.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Kim Mack. Welcome to the 6th event in the 2021 iteration of the Popular Music Books in Process series, a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the POP Conference, which has a new host institution, the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music at NYU. As always, thank you to my co-organizers, Eric Weisbart and Carl Wilson. Last week, we had a great conversation between Christy J. Wells, Gray Armstrong, and Les Gray about Christy J's forthcoming book, Between Beats, The Jazz Tradition and Black Vernacular Dance. And next week, on March 9th, Dowdy Abe, Amy Coddington, and Eric Harvey will be in conversation with Langston Colin Wilkins to discuss their respective books, Emerald Street, A History of Hip Hop in Seattle, How Hip Hop Became Hip Hop, Rap, Commercial Radio, and American Racial Identity, and Who Got the Camera, A History of Rap and Reality. And in case you're unaware, you can find the full 2021 schedule for Popular Music Books and Process events on the IASPM US website under the Journal of Popular Music Studies tab, as well as previous recorded sessions on Eric's YouTube channel. Today, we're excited to have Robert Patterson and Antonia Randolph here, who will talk about their book and book in process, Destructive Desires, Rhythm and Blues, Culture, and the Politics of Racial Equality, and That's My Heart, Queering Intimacy in Hip Hop Culture, respectively. And they will be in conversation with Elliott Powell. Dr. Robert Patterson is a professor of African American Studies and has served as the inaugural chair of the Department of African American Studies at Georgetown University, 2016 to 2019. He is the author of Destructive Desires, Rhythm and Blues Culture and the Politics of Racial Equality, Rutgers University Press 2019, and Exodus, Politics, Civil Rights and Leadership in African American Literature and Culture, from University of Virginia Press in 2013, co-editor of The Psychic Hold of Slavery, Legacies in American Expressive Culture, that was Rutgers University Press in 2016, and editor of The Black Cultural Production After Civil Rights, published by University of Illinois Press in 2019. Currently, he's working on a book titled Black Equity, Black Equality, Reparation, and Black Communities. Antonia Randolph is an assistant professor of American Studies at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her interests include diversity discourse in education, multicultural capital, non-normative Black masculinity, and the production of misogyny in hip hop culture. Her book, The Wrong Kind of Different, Challenging the Meaning of Diversity in American Classrooms, Teachers College 2012, examined the hierarchies elementary school teachers constructed among students of color. She is also published in Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, the Journal of Contemporary Ethnography, and the Feminist Wire. Her current book project, That's My Heart, Queering Intimacy in Hip Hop Culture, examines portrayals of Black men's intimate relationships in hip hop culture. Elliott H. Powell is Beverly and Richard Fink Professor in Liberal Arts and Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of Minnesota. He has been the recipient of several national fellowships and awards from the Ford Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Social Science Research Council. His first book, Sounds from the Other Side, Afro-South Asian Collaborations in Black Popular Music, was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2020. And that brings together critical race, feminist, and queer theories to consider the political implications of African American and South Asian collaborative music-making practices in US-based Black popular music since the 60s. After the discussion, there'll be a Q&A, which Eric will moderate. Please put your questions in the chat as they come to you, and Eric will find them there at the end of the discussion. And so I'll now turn things over to Antonia, Robert, and Elliott.
Thank you so much for having us. So the format we're going to use is Robert's going to read a little bit or tell us a little bit about his book, and then I'll read a little bit from my book in progress, and then Elliott will ask us questions.
Thank you all for being here with us tonight. And thank you for organizing this panel and inviting me to be part of it. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand, although I won't be able to see it. But how many of you remember where you were on the evening of February 12th, 2011? Do you remember where you were and what you were doing? Oh, Charles' hand went up. So he remembers where he was and what he was doing. And presumably he, like several of us, had just found out that Whitney Houston had passed away. And I remember that night quite vividly. I was sitting at my desk. I was talking on the phone with a friend of mine, Susanna. I was just doing random things. And she said, "Oh no." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Whitney." And I said, "What happened?" She said, "She's dead." And I ran into the other room where the television was, and became enthralled. And I use that story as an entry point into the work that I did in Destructive Desires. And I am not going to read from it tonight, but I'm going to talk through some of the points I make in the introduction throughout the book as a way of modulating the conversation that we're going to have tonight. But I do tell this story at the beginning of the book. And so that moment was profound for me, from hearing that she had died to watching her several hour long funeral to reading the autopsy report once it was actually released to the public, because I wanted to gather what was animating the response to Houston as both an artist and as a public figure. And I wanted to think through what it is that might tell us about the broader culture's fascination with the term I use throughout the book, Black intimate relations, and how Black families are organized and some of the discourses around that. And so Whitney Houston becomes a starting point for me to have that conversation. And Whitney Houston's death had been punctuated, on multiple sides. And so we had Michael Jackson, we ultimately had Prince, we have Vesta, we have Aaliyah. One of my epigraphs just names all of these deaths of artists that seem to have gone too soon. And so part of what I say is that I think that Whitney Houston's death is a part of a larger conversation about Blackness, Black life, and Black aspirations, Black desires, and Black politics. And I wanted to better understand how have public responses to Houston corroborated or contested racial norms, right? How did Houston's connections to a dangerous or taboo love objects affect her public image and her artistic production? How does Houston's public circulation through her music and her iconography help us to understand her life and her death? So in other words, the conversations about Whitney Houston was telling us something about rhythm and blues. It was telling us something about hip hop. It was telling us something about pop. In other words, there was a way that Whitney Houston's life and her artistry were, from an aesthetic standpoint, blurring some of these genre distinctions that we were making. This inability to categorize her was telling us something about post-racial, in quotation mark, post-civil rights era performances and receptions of Blackness as it intersected with other categories of identity. And that's really what I wanted to get at. And I thought that it was important to turn to music, rhythm and blues culture in particular for two reasons. The first is, as we know ad nauseum, there is discussion about how Black families are organized, right? This notion again of Black intimate relations. That Black intimate relations is at the center of public, private, social discourses, economic policy, etc. And so part of what I thought and still think are both important is as follows. If there's a place in Black cultural production that has been thinking about Black intimate relations and Black love, it's rhythm and blues culture, right? Um, Although, and part of what I want to say, the reason can be attributed to the rise of Black feminism, institutionalization of African American literary and cultural studies in the 1970s. But the primary area of cultural production of which these issues have been taken up had been in Black women's literary production. But I thought that the Rhythm and Blues Archive was a fecund place to really take a look and to examine how Black intimate relations discourses were being refracted through rhythm and blues culture. And so I use rhythm and blues culture intentionally and not rhythm and blues music, because I wanted to think about the constellation of forces that's not just about the music, but that's about the genre, what I think of as being more broad. So thinking about, for example, movies that come out in the 90s and their corresponding soundtracks. thinking about how the artists, for example, a musical artist was able to then act in movies, and that was a very intentional marketing choice rather, that allowed both pieces of cultural production to reinforce each other. And so in the examination of the Black cultural production as it related specifically to rhythm and blues culture, there are two issues that animated that conversation. The first is thinking about what are the cultural longings? What are the, in other words, what are the desires for Black people and Black communities that are projected onto Black people and Black communities and that they also espouse? And it was in that thinking that led me to the operating principle of the book, which is destructive desires. And destructive desires is the phrase that I use to describe how this cultural production is calling into question norms, for example, heteronormative marriage, that are supposed to allow Black people to excel in society. It calls into question whether or not those are actually good for Black people's thriving. And it calls into question, in a correlating way, behaviors, identities, practices that are thought to be non-norm accruing. So for example, in my discussion of Adina Howard being a freak or having a mistress, or how some of these ideas actually may contribute to Black thriving. And so I'll wrap up by saying these two things. The book takes a look in terms of case studies as Kenneth Babyface Edmonds, Adina Howard, Whitney Houston, Toni Braxton. And then in one chapter, it takes a look at a bunch of different groups and artists coming out of the 80s who sort of set this tone for what we see in the 90s and the 2000s. And part of what I'm really trying to get at in this book is to offer an intervention into the sociological discourses, into the behavioral explanations of Black inequality that presume and continue to put forth the idea that if Black people engaged in norm accruing behavior, their inequalities would be mitigated or non-existent. So in my forceful rejection of these behavioral explanations of inequality, part of what I do is sort of show how some of the music, for example, out of the 80s, espouses these non-normative behaviors, and those behaviors might actually lead to some of the diminishing of this inequality. So for example, if we look at Mtume's You, Me, and He, part of the argument that I make there is that a triangulated relationship, right? So an adult household that does not contain two people actually could reduce some of the some of the economic inequalities that we see, because if we go back to the sociological side of it, for example, we know that from studies around economics that it takes three Black working adults to get the income parity of two white working adults, and it takes 4 Black working adults to get the wealth parity. And so one of the claims that I make is that when we ignore how institutional racism, sexism, et cetera, actually operate, and we don't consider them in those conversations, we lose sight, right, of this argument how a norm-accruing heteronormative family would actually reduce inequality for Black people, because the numbers don't actually bear that out. And so I have some fun in the chapter thinking about how these triangulated relationships could actually work. And so that would be just a resonant example of thinking about destructive desires. But I'm going to stop there in terms of the overview. I'm happy to take more questions when we get into the moderated conversation and in the question and answer, where I can lay out to the more the theoretical framework, but also thinking about how neoliberalism, the decline of the welfare state, how those really also factor into this conversation in the 1970s, 80s to help us to understand the trends we see in Black rhythm and blues culture post the 1980s, 1990s. So I'll stop there and look forward to our continued conversation.
Thank you so much, Robert. This was, I I'm so glad that we are able to be in conversation with each other. When I saw your book come out, I was thrilled because there wasn't, when I started writing this book, which is about similar themes about the representations of intimate relations within Black popular music, I was like, is there nothing else? And then your book came out, I was like, oh, well, there's at least one other thing. And then I also want to shout out Veil and Vow, which is about the representation of intimate lives within popular fiction. And so there's might be a moment, a little bit of a wave where people are thinking about representations of Black intimate life in pop culture more broadly. And I'm happy to be part of that. Um, so, um, so where Robert was talking mostly about R&B culture, I'm talking about hip hop culture. And the argument of my book is thinking about how the same sort of social forces, deindustrialization, mass incarceration, and the emergence of HIV/AIDS, those different social forces shaped how Black folks were thinking about their intimate relationships. And the book talks about intimate relationships, uses it to mean friendships, family, and romantic partnerships. And then another kind of intimate relationship the book takes on is the crew. Because what I argue in the book is that these different social forces that happen in the post-civil rights era leads to a structure of feeling, a set of emotional feeling rules that becomes popular, dominant in hip hop culture, which selects for men's bonds with other men as the most appropriate way for men to get their emotional needs met is through other men. And the book is trying to say that hip hop culture is responding to these different social forces and also the kind of ideologies of the 80s, the 90s. And within hip hop culture, maybe differently from an R&B, what emerges as a dominant emotional response, maybe not the only one, but a dominant one, is what I call the homosocialization of intimacy. And you might know the homosocialization of intimacy from another term, the bromance. So in films of the 2000s, there was this focus on men's friendship with other men and how that was displacing bonds that are romantic bonds. And the book is trying to trace this homosocialization of intimacy and how it structures other sort of emotional relationships within hip hop culture. And so what I argue is that these social forces leads to this dominant emotional frame within hip hop, which says that men should look to other men for emotional support. And because relationships between men also affect relationships with women, it makes women bonds with women tangential, tangential to hostile. So I'm also trying to explain through looking at this misogynoir, the combination of anti-Blackness and misogyny that becomes a dominant strain in hip hop. So if men are looking to other men for their emotional support and they still have relationships to women, but they become marginal to their emotional life, marginal to their support, that provides a hospitable setting for this kind of contempt and hostility towards women. So I think those things are working together. So the homosocialization of intimacy, which I trace in different chapters that leads to illegible intimacies. This is a riff on Mark Anthony Neal's idea of illegible masculinities. Instead of the masculinity as being the core concept, I'm thinking about the types of bonds. So instead of prioritizing romantic partnerships, as I talk about in the chapter that I circulated for today, there's the Platonic couple. Friendships between men that are central to their lives in a way that might rival the kind of relationships they might have with a romantic partner. So the Platonic couple, instead of romantic partnerships, the group of male friends, instead of maybe a family as the central relationship, this idea of the streets raising people instead of your biological family. And then also thinking about sexuality, the way that hip hop's, a certain strain of hip hop focuses on, there's a melancholy about heterosexual sex. So the title of that chapter is Ain't No Fun. And what I'm arguing is that men are looking for ways the sex with men becomes peripheral. I'm trying to bond with my boys, and then I happen to be having a sex with a woman when I'm bonding with my boys. But really, sex with women ain't no fun. What I'm trying to do is, the point of having sex with women is to try to show off to my male friends. It's to bond with my male friends. I'm actually troubled. Like hip hop presents this kind of melancholy about heterosexual sexual relations, and so all that is a sign of the homosocialization of intimacy. So that's the sort of the big argument of the book. What I circulated for today was the chapter about platonic couples, and that chapter talks about 3 different platonic couples, Lil Wayne and Baby, or Birdman, Guru and Solar, and then Jay-Z and Kanye. Actually, that's a romantic triangle there, Jay-Z, Kanye, and Biggie. And I wanted to read a little bit from this section about Jay-Z and Kanye's friendship and their falling out. And I'm reading because it seems like in humanities folks read, unlike in sociology, so I'm trying to be a humanities scholar, so bear with me. Okay, so Kanye West longed to have the same closeness with Jay-Z that Biggie did, but never achieved it. In fact, as of this writing, Kanye and Jay-Z are strained, as are Lil Wayne and Baby. Unlike with Biggie, Kanye and Jay-Z were not equals when they began their friendship. As noted earlier, dyadic friendships are harder to sustain when there's a power imbalance. Nor were they equally invested in the relationship, as Kanye was a budding producer hoping to make beats for Jay-Z and get signed to his record label as a rapper. Kanye seemed to want the relationship more than Jay-Z did, such that they never had the easy overlap between their professional and personal lives that Jay-Z had with Biggie. The dynamics of their friendship point to the personal and social risks of being in a platonic couple. I go on to talk about how Kanye, if this was a TV show, the Kanye part would be under the heading "He's not that into you" in terms of how he related to Jay-Z. If we're thinking about it in the frames of romantic couple, and how is Kanye negotiating this fact that he really longed for Jay-Z's approval, but also closeness to Jay-Z. So where was the closeness between Jay-Z and Kanye if they don't have that as much in common as Jay-Z and Biggie have in common? Kanye wanted to be in the lineage of Biggie Smalls and Jay-Z. He claims Jay-Z as his big brother, but labels Jay-Z as Big's brother. Here, Kanye subtly acknowledges the difference in his standing vis-a-vis Jay-Z compared to Biggie. Jay-Z and Biggie were equals. He was Jay-Z's little brother. Jay-Z also recognizes this imbalance in their relationship, saying, "That's my brother. We're beyond friends. We're really, like literally, my little brother's Kanye," end quote. Still, Kanye's claim to Jay-Z's little brother implies that he has some of the same qualities as his idol. Kanye seeks some Jay-Z status as a great MC by virtue of his association with him. He is putting himself among the greats, Biggie, Jay-Z, and to a lesser extent, Kanye. Kanye shows his desire to match Jay-Z at commercial success, if not rap skills in Big Brother, when he says, "I guess Beanie Style was more of a slam dunk, but my shit was more like a finger roll. Well, I had them singles though." Kanye complains here about the fact that Jay-Z pushed another Rockefeller artist album, Beanie Siegel, harder than his album, yet he still had them singles that were successful, showing that Kanye deserved more support. Okay, so where's their bond? If it's not because Jay-Z and Kanye are equally good as rappers, they're not both from Brooklyn, they're not both from the streets in terms of hustling, where's their bond? And yet Otis and the album Watch the Thrones was also the beginning of the end of their closeness. Oh wait, jumped to the wrong part. Jay-Z and Kanye did share a passion for 70s soul music. Their best work together features Jay-Z rapping over Kanye's soul samples. The song Otis off their joint album, Watch the Throne, epitomizes Kanye's quest for lineage and his desire to be best friends with Jay-Z. The song is built over a sample from Otis Redding's Try a Little Tenderness. Kanye's genius is in building soundscapes with overwhelming emotional impact. In this case, he sampled the na 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 part of Redding's ad lib between verses to serve as the melody for the song and put a spare but thumping drum beat under it. Otis might be a distillation of Kanye's musical palette, well-chosen soul samples over boom bap rap beats. And Jay-Z and Kanye make the most of the music, trading verses about how rich they are until the song climaxes with a loop of Redding screaming. As effective as the song is, the video is what exemplifies the aspirations within Kanye's relationship with Jay. It features the two of them in a deserted parking lot with a giant American flag in the background, dressed similarly in long white t-shirts, jeans, and chunky jewelry, doing spin-outs in a sports car. They walk towards us and take turns rapping into the camera. They hang off each other. Jay-Z's arm thrown over Kanye's shoulder, Jay-Z bobbing behind Kanye as he rhymes. Other shots show women screaming with delight as in the backseat of the car. Kanye driving with Jay-Z in the passenger seat, dust shooting out from the wheels from the speed. The video is full of boyish exuberance, from its fancy car and women as accessories moments to the exploding car batteries that punctuate the screaming at the end like fireworks. Kanye and Jay-Z look like best friends living out their boyhood fantasies of the good life as adult men. Their joy is infectious. They show their closeness through their physical contact that is atypical of rap videos, especially for two men by themselves. The video suggests that they are in their own world, where the other people are just extensions of their desires. The video taps into what they share: cockiness, ambition, love of flaunting their wealth, and perhaps most importantly, a deep love of soul music. Kanye gets to embody both his inheritance from Jay-Z and from 70s soul in the video. Jay-Z and Kanye's bodies merge in the many scenes where Jay-Z hangs off of Kanye's body, while Otis Redding's voice is another physical presence pulsing beneath the rhymes they accentuate with their gestures. Otis is the height of what their closeness could contain, the melding of soul and rap and love of wealth with any stench of the struggle to achieve it washed away. So I'll leave it there, just thinking about the different types of closeness that Jay-Z and Kanye have.
So I want to first thank Robert and very much Antonia for sort of inviting me to kind of moderate this whole kind of discussion. I especially want to thank Antonia for the invitation. I want to keep my comments brief here because I want to obviously give time for folks to ask their own questions. I'll start off though with, I think, as I think we all should, with praise, which is to say that Robert, your book, right? Fantastic. And very much, and really sort of very much needed. And then Antonia, I think your intervention in hip hop studies, in Black cultural studies, obviously in queer studies as well. I think these are much needed kinds of interventions. One of the things that I think you all very much sort of resonate on, that I think is really important to highlight, is you both are very much interested in the political, right? Which is to say that the state has very much rendered very much intimacy, political for Black people. I'll say this, political Black people in terms of the Americas, right? So I'm thinking here about how the state has been, since the moment of engendered flesh, been invested within the intimacies of Black people, right? And so we can think about the kinds of investment of the state when it comes to intimacy as a kind of sexual relation. We can think about sort of intimacies for Black people as a kind of domestic, as a kinship kind of formation, but also we can think about the state's investment in the regulations of Blackness and Black bodies through I think sort of notions of sort of intimacy as that just being a kind of relation, right? Which might actually really sort of manifest into something called friendship, right? That the state has always been invested in interrupting the ways in which Black people are producing and providing and theorizing these notions of intimacy. And so for me at least, in both of your projects, the ways in which you're thinking about R&B and rap through these kinds of frameworks of intimacies is very much a way to think also about culture and politics, right? And I think this becomes a kind of huge connection between your work, but I think it's also an important contribution to how we think about, and for me, in terms of how we think about Black cultural studies, I'm also thinking about Richard Iden here and his work in terms of really, in terms of theorizing really sort of the Black fantastic. I think that the work that you two are doing is very, very critical in how you're actually thinking about R&B and hip hop as giving us new ways of thinking about the political as it very much interfaces and intersects with really sort of the aesthetic here. So praise, I want to first really praise that point. I also want to praise this particular kind of conversation between your two works, importantly because as I assume that most of us are very much familiar with, right? There is this kind of conventional narrative that sort of the quote unquote death of R&B or very much so the kind of death of rhythm and blues came at the emergence of hip hop, right? This is a conventional narrative that we hopefully know is not true, but I think one of the things that both you in terms of Antonia and Robert do in this whole kind of conversation about your works is really trying to kind of think about these intersections of R&B and hip hop through really intimacy here. Right, that becomes a central rubric, a central kind of framework in a way to think through the kinds of complexities between R&B and hip hop. That doesn't necessarily see a kind of linear narrative here in Black music, but rather thinks about these very sort of interesting twists and temporalities through sort of intimacy as it gets formed and articulated in Black music. So that's the second kind of praise. So I now want to just launch into one really sort of key question for me, at least, has a lot to do, and really sort of, Antonia, you kind of sort of brought this up when you said that you wanted to read from your paper, and you, as you're trained as a sociologist, I'm actually kind of curious if you all could talk a little bit about methodology here. Right, obviously you're both thinking sort of interdisciplinarily here, but I want to hear more about your kind of methodological approach to your, I want to think about how you think about methods in your work.
So I'll do the academics. You ask one question, I'm gonna talk about something I want to talk about first, and then I'll answer. But
He's the guy.
But what I wanted to say, because I think it's relevant. So part of what I think is so fascinating to what you said, Elliott, and thank you for those comments. But part of what I think is fascinating is that, so part of why rhythm and blues gets marginalized when hip hop ascends as a cultural production and is institutionalized in terms of academic study in the mid-90s, I think it's for multiple reasons, but one of which is Mark Anthony Neal talks about this. There's this whole thinking that, rhythm and blues is just another bunch of sad love songs, right? And he uses the phrase like this rhythm and blues, it was referred to as rhythm and bullshit, right? As a way of underscoring that. And to me, I thought that was an important entry point because of all of the ideas it signals. For example, a main one being as if love and intimacy are not political and politicized. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, as it relates to hip hop and sort of these realist aesthetics that are very much thought of when thinking about Black culture, the idea is that, hip hop is sort of, this real, right? It's providing an authentic Black experience as opposed to this imaginative crap that rhythm and blues is providing. And so there's this sort of notion of interiority in rhythm and blues that's not significant versus a lack of interiority in hip hop, and that those get gendered in particular ways. And so there's almost sort of this masculinization of hip hop, and it's an effeminization and marginalization of rhythm and blues, which is why I think the work that you're doing, Antonia, is so great, right? Because you're bringing into that conversation those gender politics in hip hop that are sometimes very present, though marginalized. As far as it relates specifically to your question about the methodologies, so for me, part of what I was thinking was, how is it, this is building on a claim that Alex Waheli makes about interdisciplinarity, and sometimes interdisciplinarity is thought of as multidisciplinarity. You're just putting different things together, but not necessarily putting them in conversation and bringing them to bear. So part of what I wanted to do was to think about how the humanities and social sciences could talk to each other through Black cultural production. And so I use this phrase called entangled networks as well. And that's part of what I'm doing in there, is looking at how, for example, we make meaning through not just the lyrics, but the music videos, how they add another layer, how a soundtrack adds a layer, how the artist brand adds a layer. And so part of what I'm trying to do is construct an archive and pull it apart at the same time. And to think about how that becomes a broader methodology in African American studies or Black studies more generally, right? You can't understand Du Bois as just a sociologist, and you can't understand him as just someone who is a literary and cultural producer. But when you put these two together, not applying them to one each other, but seeing what they say about and to each other. And so I try to use the entangled networks in this archive of rhythm and blues culture as a way to model how to do exactly that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Really, thank you for the sort of praise, Elliott, and also the question for methodology. I was wondering about methodology for this work because my first work was ethnography from schools, and that data that's a really conventional way to do a sociology-based book. But now with this book, I want to say I started off with the categories that I wanted to study. So platonic couples, and then crews, and the family in some fashion, and sexual behavior in some fashion. And then I relied a lot on my own knowledge of hip hop to sort of get to what the cases would be. But then also I do have this, in good sociologist fashion, I created a database of the platinum selling rap albums between 88 and 2006. And so I can kind of ground truth my claims through using that database of songs to see if I'm very far off the mark from the broader trends within that database. So I'm hoping the book will be featuring different case studies of artists, and it's focused on artists and songs, but also will include the chapter on crews will talk about Of Mics and Men, the documentary about Wu-Tang Clan. So the chapter on crews is mostly about visual culture, because I'm interested in how people visualize massness of Black men and what sort of problems that creates for the regulation of Black male bodies, the way that in the 80s and 90s with broken windows policies, that the fact of Black men in groups was a problem in terms of the law. And so I'm interested in visual culture in that chapter. So that chapter is going to talk about the documentary. It's going to talk about the video for All Right by Kendrick Lamar. It's going to talk about hip hop anthems, those videos for hip hop anthems. And so depending on what the question is for different chapters, I use different sources. But I would say the methodology started with the different questions of each chapter, and then try to accumulate the sources that will allow me to speak to those questions. But then it's going to be hopefully triangulated with this database of the platinum selling rap albums from 88 to 2006.
Thank you both. I have one very quick question, and then I just want to kick it out to everyone else. I'll say this, one of the things that I think also ties both of your work is really this concept of loss. And for obviously sort of Antonia, the way in which you're thinking about whether it's Kanye, whether it's Guru, whether or not it's these series of artists, right? You're thinking about these kind of alternative forms of intimacy that can emerge from sort of lost friendships, right? And then sort of similarly, Robert, right? How you think through these alternative, non-heteronormative kinds of relations that R&B can give us seems to be articulated and expressed through a kind of sort of lamenting, right? That sort of heteronormativity blocks these other ways of being, right? And so I wanted to see if you all could talk a little bit more about loss. And here I'm actually thinking about sort of Javon Johnson's work, who thinks about bereavement as a side of possibilities for alternative kinds of notions around masculinity. So I'll just leave that there to just kind of ask you if you have sort of any other thoughts around the topic of loss here.
I mean, I can jump in. I think that's an interesting way to put it. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I think so much of what's happening in hip hop culture is haunted by the black people's inability to be heteronormative, and then it does by necessity create different possibilities, but the desire to be heteronormative is still there, and so I might turn to it's like a both and. So the men and the songs that I'm looking at, or the albums I'm looking at, they turn to their other male friends as their primary source of emotional support. But that doesn't mean that they don't feel like they don't have words for Black women for being unable to be the kind of partners that they would be if they were white women. You know, Hortense Spiller, if only Black women were white, then Black men could be able to love them, but they're not. And so there's like there's this generative sense of loss that means that I create new forms of sociality, homosociality in this case, but I'm still tethered to heteronormative ideas about what family should look like, what friendship should look like, what romantic partnership should look like. And I think that, that winds up being taken out on the hide of Black women often, that if Black women would only perform the way women should, then we'd have a different kind of relationship. If Black mothers could only be Black fathers, but Black fathers are absent. And so I kind of have ambivalence towards the presence of Black mothers. That's one of the arguments I make in the family about how I turn to the streets to raise me because I don't have Black men in the home. And of course, Black families can't exist without Black men, although they do. And, so there's negotiating of, what normativity requires out of intimate relationships. And I must go on and find other ways to meet those needs, but I'll continue to hold Black communities to these other standards that weren't ever meant to serve you.
Thank you. I think that's true. So two places I would say where I see this particularly. So one of the more fascinating, one of my favorite parts about the book was, in writing it, was that I flew out to Arizona and interviewed Adina Howard. And so the interview, a truncated version, I'll put it like that, and redacted in some respects, version of that appears in the book in one of the appendices. But it was this interesting moment because we were sitting down having a conversation about her, sort of how she had negotiated some of these issues around normativity, how, I asked her, did she harbor any resentment from the fact that as her career was being, tampered down by some of the execs at BET at the time, and et cetera, at the moment that R. Kelly's is sort of taking off. We talked through this and she didn't seem to have any misgivings about that. But when I asked her sort of about her favorite R&B artists out of the 90s, and as much as she was perhaps pushing back against some of the norms around Black women's sexuality and its expression, she was simultaneously just both invested in certain performances of Black masculinity. And so in that moment, right, I was thinking about, what does it mean, for example, to sort of want to lose these restrictions that bind you, but yet want to bind someone else to that. And so I don't really talk about that as much in the book, but I thought about that. But where the question really gets dead on in the book is in the chapter on Whitney Houston. And it's particularly relevant there, not only because of, at the time, sort of innuendo from Bobby Brown about Whitney Houston's relationship with Robin Crawford, which then later became, affirmed by Robin Crawford's own assertions. But looking at this documentary, Can I Be Me, thinking about what people have said, sort of, and part of the chapter thinks about this. If Whitney Houston had been able to live outside of, certain notions of heteronormativity, which were compounded by so many issues for her in particular, what would that have meant and what would that have looked like, right? And that's part of what the chapter is imagining there too, is that, she made a calculation, it seemed, not that all choices were equal, about what one form of loss would look like, right? So if she loses heteronormativity, what are the things she would lose? And then if she doesn't lose heteronormativity, what does she end up losing? And so it's just a fascinating thing to think about. But I think you hit the dead on the head with this whole notion that on the one hand, there's this desire for something, even if it is perfunctory, even if it is secondary, back to your "it ain't no fun" analogy and topic too.
Cool. Well, should I throw some questions out from the chat? Tyler, you want to start us off?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, and thanks to both of you for this incredible panel so far. And Dr. Randolph, I'm a big fan of your work. And so I'm very interested in the structure of feeling that you were kind of outlining at the beginning. And if I misunderstood this, please kind of correct my misunderstanding. But it seemed like you were arguing that there was sort of a homosocial structure of feeling in hip hop culture that emerges in the wake of mass incarceration, HIV/AIDS, and deindustrialization. So this gets me thinking about, Trisha Rose, and of course her relation of hip hop culture to deindustrialization, and then even thinking about the way that Dyson writes about hip hop and mass incarceration, or even Eric Nielsen and Andrea Dennis with mass incarceration and those relationships between the two. And so I'm curious about if this structure of feeling, if I'm characterizing it correctly, is temporally bound. Like, has it transformed since the late 90s and early 2000s? And I was even thinking, like, with Wayne and Baby's relationship, does it transform post Katrina, or is there a specific kind of environmental shift in the way that these structures of feelings kind of emerge in different spaces? And I was thinking about kind of J-Rock and Kendrick on Redemption, which I think was 2018, and how there's sort of this like renewed kind of brotherhood between them that is supposed to be renewing the kind of thing they grew up together with, or even between Ninth Wonder and his interaction with sort of his mentees on Jamla, and how there are these public kind of displays of affection between someone like Ruben Vincent or GQ on that label and Ninth Wonder, and just trying to think through, is this, I guess, subsumable under the same rubric? Is it, has it transformed, or is it different? Yeah, I think that's essentially my question.
No, thanks so much for that question, Tyler. It raises one of the claims that I want to stress within the book, which is that the norms around intimacy in hip hop changes over time. It's because there's an approach to hip hop, to masculinity with hip hop, which is masculinity in hip hop is always and forever misogynistic, or it's static. It's kind of a static relationship to the sort of relationships in hip hop. And I think there's social forces happening in the 80s and 90s, the post-civil rights era, the ones that I named. But I think so those are like the external things, but I don't think homosocialization and intimacy, this sort of the content of rap itself and the visualization of rap itself, I don't think it starts to emphasize men's bonds with other men until the golden age of hip hop. And so I think it takes the rise of something like gangster rap and the kind of cultural nationalism of political rappers to really make this men's bonds with other men's the topic of a central topic of hip hop. There were the conditions. There was necessary but not sufficient. That the kind of conditions of deindustrialization and mass incarceration creates conditions for this to be a central topic and a central structure of feeling. But I think there's something happening internally with hip hop, with the rise of gangster rap, which is about gangs after all, which is about communities of men, and then cultural nationalism within political hip hop. Public Enemy talking about troop or crew, not singular. They're sort of making it normative for people to look. We have to think in terms of moving in teams of people, and the teams of people are male. And gangster rap is saying, I roll with my gang. And so, even though the conditions were there, I think things are happening internally within hip hop to make those that norm rise to the surface. So yeah, I think it's so, and it could change. And I think we're living. I think hip hop today is still within this homosocialization intimacy. I think that's still a dominant modality of feeling, but I think it could be different if conditions were different, and if internally hip hop was selecting for different kind of stories.
Thank you so much.
Anne has urged me to ask others in who are not our regulars. So Danielle, would you like to ask your question?
Oh, sure. I think this is a question for both Antonia and Robert. Thank you for this conversation, because I think it's important to connect R&B and hip hop. As somebody who's like, doesn't consider herself like a big hip hop fan, was a big fan of like R&B in the 90s, and thinking about like the connections, right? Like between, yeah, this has been a really helpful conversation to think about the connections between these two genres and like their impacts on broader culture. So yeah, and you study, like, you seem to study like kind of, there's like overlapping and kind of consecutive eras. Antonia's kind of stretches out to the mid 2000s. I'm wondering if we take seriously the feeling rules that Antonia outlines in hip hop, homosocialization of intimacy, I'm wondering like what that means for R&B, like in our current moment, right? Like, do we see, like, what is R&B in our current? I have a lot of questions about that, but like, what is it? Yeah, I think there's some, yeah, these feeling rules are hitting on something, and I'm wondering, like, Robert, what your thoughts are about like what it might mean for R&B, and then I'm guessing more broadly, like, what are the implications of these feeling rules for Black culture more generally? Because it seems like both of y'all are talking. You're talking about genres of music, but you're also talking about Black cultural production, right? And so, which impacts, to my understanding, right, like folks who aren't even necessarily like super into one genre or another, right? It sort of impacts the whole.
And this blurring of genres, that I do think that the commercialization of hip hop, for example, does allow for this this blurring of genres. And so one of the big transitions you see coming out of the mid 90s into the 2000s in terms of R&B is the movement from groups to individuals, right? And there are a couple of issues that make that not only say necessary, but some of the competition from hip hop, the perceived competition at least, actually does that, increases and changes in technology, right? So if you have a group of 5 people and one person is really the lead singer, right, and you have these 4 of the backup people, you can now synthesize and you can create artificially that sound, right? And so you don't necessarily need the group. But 2 things to what you said. So the homosocialization and thinking about those type of relationships, what's interesting about that in hip hop is a lot of the music itself is heteronormative. At least that's how it casts, right? There's these heteronormative love songs, even if the producers themselves are not in heteronormative relationships, right? There's a cultural currency to the heteronormativity, and that oftentimes, and this is part of what I love about the work my colleagues working on, is that, you know, a lot of the discussion about homosocialization is about women or Black women's relationships in particular ways. But one of the things about the current state of R&B I think is important was the rise of TV1 in 2009, not particularly, or not only because of its desire to cater to Black audiences and certain demographics, but when you think about the shows that come on TV1, and I talk about this on one of the tracks in the introduction. So you get Unsung, which started out as a 4-episode pilot and has blossomed into, you know, a pretty large staple in there. You get the R&B divas, right? You get the Life After, which included several R&B artists. And so you get this interest in rhythm and blues culture and other forms of culture of music that takes us back to the high era of R&B that you're talking about. And so you see these artists who, Selena Johnson, right? You see certain artists who sort of kind of after groups or whatever the case is, went away. But then between 2009 and now, they've kind of resurfaced. And part of this has much to do with TV1 and this archive, these entangled networks of these different, of the broader rhythm and blues culture. As far as rhythm and blues, what it is goes, I punt on this a little bit in my book. And so I talk historically about, you know, the move from Motown and kind of these sounds. But it's one of those things where when you hear it, you know. And it's not about punting per se, but it's a hard thing to actually describe. I mean, this was part of the challenge of what Whitney Houston, I think, is as a nice bookend to this discussion, because she was in so many genres, right? And there is fluidity within the genre. But thinking thematically about familiar interpersonal relations, right? Thinking about a certain sound, a certain beat. When I think about rhythm and blues, there's a range within that. But I do think that those are some of the markers that I'm looking for and listening for. And there are times when, you know, a song comes on the radio, I know who it is, right? I tell people all the time, Toni Braxton actually does not have to make another new song. She has. But if Toni Braxton went touring, talking about Toni Braxton's secrets in the heat, she would live well for the rest of her life, right? Because of this period you identify, there's this heyday of what's thought of as a particular form of R&B from the 90s.
Yeah, I want to make these R&B. What is R&B? I think some of the norms of hip hop migrated into R&B with something like Jodeci, with the rise of hip hop's soul, and I think R&B is the worst off for it. The norms of hip hop of making romantic relationships, romance incidental. I think that norm has made its way over into R&B, such that this kind of songs that people write about romance aren't very convincing today. Right. And I don't think it's just because I'm old. I mean, I am old, but I do think the quality of the quality of this songwriting R&B has been in decline. And I think part of it is because they've adopted some of the ethics, the emotional rules of hip hop, so that you can't really make a love song that will be lasting, because you're talking about sex as you talk about animosity between romantic partners. You're talking about sex in the club. I don't know. It's not about romance, love in the club. Sorry, Usher. You're talking about things that aren't about connection between two people, because the ethics in hip hop says that there aren't connections between men and women that should be centered. Hip hop is a dominant genre of Black popular culture. It's a dominant culture, period. And I think, to Danielle's question about what happens with the ethics of hip hop because it affects Black pop culture generally, when the final chapter of the book talks about how the norms of hip hop, the emotional norms of hip hop, get taken up in non-hip hop spaces. And that last chapter talks about the last Black man in San Francisco, which is all about two male friends, a platonic couple. There's like one Black woman in the movie. It's about Danny Glover and the two men, their kind of family that is not a normative family. All those sort of tropes of hip hop turns up in the last Black man in San Francisco, which is itself a kind of movie that produces a caricature of hip hop. So the movie itself features no hip hop music. In fact, it makes this critique of hip hop that's pretty one-dimensional, but the emotional relationships in The Last Man in San Francisco adopts a lot of those emotional norms within hip hop. So I think the kind of influence in hip hop far exceeds the reach of people who are fans of hip hop, because those norms are norms of culture more broadly, not just the norms of hip hop at this point. So that's how I'm thinking about it.
Nice. How about Tennille? You want to ask your question and tell us about your sister?
Sure. Thank you so much for taking my question. And I think that it really fits in well with the point that Antonia was just making really quickly. My sister was a student in 2000, and 112 came to her school, and Slim tried to pick her up, which was both hilarious in some ways, but also very disturbing because of the age difference. But thinking about the point that you were just making, Antonia, in terms of these non-traditional, these non-normative families, I'm wondering about something that started emerging for me as I was reading your chapter a little bit earlier. And it was this whole notion of the uncle, right? Thinking about this as it emerges in hip hop, and I guess I'm thinking about this in R&B as well. So I'm thinking about people like LL Cool J, right? I'm thinking about people, unfortunately, like Russell Simmons. I'm thinking about people like Luke Campbell. I'm thinking about the moniker given to people like Charlie Wilson in R&B, and wondering how that fits into these notions around family and intimacy that are claimed when we're using that term uncle. And I think about that both in terms of music, but also certainly how this might have implications in larger Black culture.
That's a really interesting question to know. I hadn't thought about that, but that's true. I wonder what work Uncle is doing. When I saw LL start calling himself Uncle L, I thought it was a way to claim elderness without having to be old. Like a father would be too old, but if I'm an uncle, I'm a little older, but I'm still young enough to pick up women. I don't actually know, but I think Uncle is trying to do something right. But I think the status of uncle is giving us a sense of exalted male family member, where father is too fraught in Black communities for all the reasons that Robert and I are talking about. To claim status of father, a father figure in Black communities raises the specter of absentee Black fathers. It's too much demands will be put on you to say that you're a father. But I think if you can slide into the slot of I'm the uncle, that gives me some cachet of having familial status of an older statesman without having to take on to address like the absentee Black father. So thank you for that, Tennille.
Robert, did you want to speak to that also? You kind of look like you did.
You know what? I'm in the season of learning to keep my mouth shut, and so but it's apparently not working. So, because when you were saying it, it made me. I had a couple different thoughts, right? So I thought about sometimes the problematic uncle figure, and not mentor, but how that plays out in gender relationships. And I thought about that particularly with Uncle Luke, because I think I don't think that is a sort of a mentor. I think that that's sort of the grandfather. Not I shouldn't make that up, but the orchestrator of a certain type of music. And right, drunk uncles, a certain type of music, and sort of the videos and all things that went with that. And so I was just thinking about how it registers differently with the set of people that Tennille had asked in the question. And so that was partially it.
All right, excellent, thank you. Anne, are you ready to come in?
I have to unmute. Hi, thanks. Sorry I came in late, but this is such a great discussion, and we're having fun in the chat too, talking about the meaning of R&B. So I wish it could go on all night. But my initial question is actually for Antonia. I love that you're writing on cruise as a visual phenomenon, and I wanted to ask you about Wu-Tang Clan in relation to this, because when I was working for the Times, I reviewed them a couple times, I think, and one time notably at I think it was Hammerstein Ballroom. This was when ODB was a fugitive from the law, and he showed up to the show, but there were so many people on stage that he was sort of like he actually took the mic and rhymed and everything, but then he was like hidden and you know, kind of like carried off by his crew. And he was later arrested and returned to rehab like 2 days later. But I also know at that time, there was a lot of talk that Wu-Tang, especially at big festival shows like Lollapalooza or Rock the Bells, would kind of use imposters or substitute members of their crew and, like, you know, insert people who weren't in the group to go on stage. And I love this idea of a crew as a kind of I don't know what to call it, not a chimera, I don't know, but it's like an abacus where you move things around. That's not the right word, but you can come up with this word. But I wondered if you thought about Wu-Tang and the hugeness of their crew and the strange substitutions in the crew and all of that.
Oh my God, we have somebody who cited Blue Imposters. Wow, that's kind of great though. I love that kind of solution to the need. Like, I'm thinking about the work that crews do for people in terms of what type of relationship it enables. And if ODB wants to perform, it's safe for him to perform because there's so many people on stage that who sees when he slips away. No one can. But it's a form of care. Like when somebody doesn't feel like rhyming for that day, put in one of the Killer Bees. There's a million of them. There's a million Wu spinoff groups, and he just substitute one of those folks in. I mean, there are what, 9 Wu-Tang official members? Just bring in somebody else. Nobody actually knows those other two, Capadonna and Master Kill. I mean, yeah, like who knows those other two? So you just switch them in. But I think it's fascinating. The crews are a fascinating object for me, especially the visual of the crews. How many of y'all have been to a hip hop concert? Thumb up, thumbs up. Who are all those dudes on stage?
Right.
You've been to hip hop concerts, and that's sort of what I'm thinking about with the crew. What is the necessity? What are all those dudes on stage doing it? And Wu-Tang Clan, there's actually a reason they're official members of the crew. They can rhyme, but in general, at hip hop concerts, they are like manifesting the massness of the people they know.
Yeah.
And in the way that, if Parliament Funkadelic have a bunch of people on stage, it's because they all play an instrument. If Earth, Wind & Fire have a bunch of people on stage, it's because they all do something. But when you go to a Nas concert, there's just a bunch of folk on stage. And I think that's something about the ethics within hip hop, that they're sort of like performing for us. And I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I think I'll just say one more thing, which is that it makes me think about the work Michael Kramer did about the counterculture hippie scene in the days of Ken Kesey and the shows, I'm sorry, I got the vaccine today and I can't think right now. So anyway, I'm a little spaced out. But anyway, I'm thinking about Ken Kesey and those acid tests he would do and how the membrane between the audience and the performers was eliminated. And there were people going on stage and the performers were going into the audience and all of this was happening. It's sort of an interesting parallel phenomenon in the counterculture.
Cool. Let's see. Carl, you've been waiting a while.
Oh, I've been happy to be waiting. But yeah, it was in Antonia's reading, I was struck when we were talking about the story of Jay and Kanye, about the sort of sequel to that, which is, in the past decade, it's really become Jay and Beyonce as the pairing. And that kind of disrupts this homosociality. And they kind of present themselves as kind of a paradigmatic ideal in the culture. And it's almost sort of deliberately speaking back to it. And there's another thing too that goes back to some of the things that we've been talking about in the meanwhile, which is that it's also a marriage of hip hop and R&B on a level, right? So I'm just curious about how the Carters as a unit kind of figure in this dynamic for you.
No, thank you for that question, Carl. I'll address it, but I also want to bring Robert in to talk about not the book, but the article about marriage panacea, because that was one of the things I'm working through in this last chapter in the book, which is about, there is sort of a resurgence. There's a hearkening back to normative Black families, and Jay-Z and Beyonce and the Carters album. My last chapter talks about that album, and it also talks about Chance's album, which is about his marriage. Because I think there is, to Elliott's point, there's a mourning, there's a longing to be normative. And there's a longing to be, just a family with a Black man at the head, and they got kids and all these sort of things. And even though hip hop produced a different kind of relationality that isn't centered around that, I don't think the desire to be that ever goes away. And Jay-Z and Beyonce can produce that for us, and we're supposed to admire it. And it's, like you said, an ideal type. And so I don't think hip hop has, I think hip hop has internalized the marriage panacea, which I'll have Robert define for you. But out of necessity, it looks for other sorts of relationships, these relationships with men, but they've never given up on, if only I can find someone to marry and have a normal family, I would like that too.
Yeah, I mean, and this is to echo back a point I was making earlier. I mean, this is the whole thing with Bobby Brown, Whitney Houston, and Robin Crawford to some respects. And so, and as you were saying that, I was thinking about even how cruel optimism works as well, right? So thinking about, the very thing I might desire might be my destruction, but it doesn't make me desire it any less. And so the marriage is panacea, and that essay, which becomes some of the earlier thinking around the ideas I developed in Destructive Desires, is just really thinking that, or it's the notion that, marriage, heterosexual marriage will solve all of Black people's problems, whether they're social, economic, right? It literally is the cure-all solution to all inequities and all inequalities. And so the article goes on to talk about why it's problematic and sure that that's the case. But even for people for whom it doesn't work, they still are deeply invested in that idea too. And so how do you break that? How do you break that?
Nice.
Thanks so much. That was great.
Let's see, Jeffrey, would you like to come on?
No, I just added a question straightforward, and then I cited Robert. There's a PDF down there. But it was just great to hear these wonderful talks. And Antonia, I really, really am excited about this project as I was before. And before my son tries to get on here and take over the camera, I'm just gonna stop. But that question was just exactly. So there it is. But no, it was just really great to hear such fascinating work. And Robert, I love you. So all right.
You too, Jeff. Good to hear you.
And I'll invoke another all-star from the chat and make sure see if she has a question. Kaylin?
Oh, I don't have a question. I was just thinking of in terms of the more current artists. So like Cardi B and Offset's relationship. I mean, it's Cardi B and Offset, Saweetie and Quavo. I forgot the rapper's name. I don't know if it's like NLE Chopper or Lil Baby, but like that has like a baby recently with Floyd Mayweather's daughter, and kind of how they idolize these quote unquote B and Jay-Z type of relationships. But because it's like on the main screen via social media, I've noticed that it's almost as if like whatever's showing up on social media will then turn into a song, right? And then kind of like back and forth, which is very just interesting to me. Love and Hip Hop, I saw someone say that like those type of like relationships where they idolize being in the industry together as a power couple, but it's really actually just toxic and like a faux power couple.
Which brings me to neoliberalism, which Robert referenced but didn't talk. I mean, this idea that this individual couple will pull you up by your bootstraps and heteronormativity will save the day, and internalizing this idea of individual success and capitalism and music industry as the way to save the Black community. No, but I think you're right that Beyonce and Jay-Z, the most prominent example of it, but I think other people are following that blueprint of kind of branding their couples as something to be idolized and to be consumed as hopefulness for Black communities. It would be interesting to think about Kanye and Kim as in this mix, because Kanye and Kim are not, Kanye and Kim are a couple. They're noteworthy people in their own right, and they're getting divorced now. But I don't know if they're functioning in the same kind of way, like get on our level. Partly because Kim doesn't function as a Black woman. In fact, a Black woman have lots of problems with her. So it can't quite work in the same way, but they are a prominent couple. But I don't think they're doing the same sort of thing.
I would also say, I saw the question when you phrased it in the chat and made it a point to say these faux power couples. And I think that the social media or the shows, the shows that are actually on TV or social media, the constructedness of these images in the neoliberal era, I think we can't kind of lose sight of how the marketplace is responding to dynamics about race as it intersects with capitalism, but pretending that that's not the case, which is part of the whole fiction of the reality show, not being a representation. And I think that that's significant to what you were saying.
All right, I should probably stop us because this has been a long, although really rich and interesting session. So thank you to all of our panelists. I can't wait to preserve the chat text and send it to y'all so you have it to watch it weave and go here and there and everywhere. So thank you all. Real quickly, I should mention that next week we've got a special topic gathering on rap, radio, and reality with Daoudi Abe's Emerald Street, A History of Hip Hop, Amy Coddington's In Progress study of hip hop's relationship to commercial radio, Eric Harvey's take on rap in relationship to reality TV, and the moderator Langston Colin Wilkins. So thanks to you all and see you soon.